If you want to be great with a camera, it's essential to understand how shutter speed and aperture work. What are they? Well, they are what control your shot's exposure, how bright or how dark the image appears, and you need to understand how they work together to do this. Let's say your camera lens is like your eye. Shutter speed is like your camera's eyelid. It measures how long the lens is open and lets light in. The aperture is like your camera's iris. The wider it is, the more light gets through the lens. How these two work together can be explained by looking at the exposure triangle. If your camera was set to a slow shutter speed, say having it open for half a second, that's a lot of light coming through the lens. And also any movement will be blurry. Typically, if you're going to shoot something handheld, it's smart to not go slower than 1/30th of a second if you want a sharp image. Anything slower than that, get a tripod. If you change your setting to have a faster shutter speed, you can then freeze or stop motion. At 1/250th of a second, you will start freezing motion, but if your subject is very fast, you'll need a faster shutter speed. Keep in mind that the faster the shutter speed, the darker the image, because it's less time for light to enter through the lens to your camera's sensor. To illustrate this, let's say you're trying to get a shot of a spinning skirt. With a slow shutter speed, the motion of the skirt is very blurred. Maybe not the best shot. If you bump your shutter speed, you start to see a sharper, more detailed image when you take a shot. Now, with aperture, the larger the hole in the lens, the more light gets in, just like your eye's iris. Aperture is measured in f-stops, which you'll notice here look like fractions. That means an f-stop, like 2.8, is quite a large aperture. An aperture like f22 has a smaller hole, making the exposure of your shot darker. This is what your camera looks like when you change your aperture, large, like 2.8, to small, like 22 or some other big number. This example illustrates how much aperture affects how overexposed your image is or how dark or underexposed it is. Aperture also affects how deep or how shallow your depth of field is. Basically, this means how much of your shot can be in focus at any given time. A large aperture like 2.8 gives you a shallow depth of field, meaning only a portion of the image will be in focus. And smaller apertures like 22 will have basically the entire shot in focus. Both make for beautiful images. If you need a deep depth of field, you'd use a small aperture, but if that makes your image too dark, try a slower shutter speed to compensate, and vice versa. If, after playing around with aperture and shutter speed, your image is still too dark, then you might want to consider changing your ISO. This will affect how sensitive your camera sensor is to any light coming through the lens. Try to keep ISO levels low, as each time you bump it higher, you do lose quality in the image. The best way to really understand shutter speed and aperture is to go out and practice. Become familiar with your equipment. Get out there and photograph this beautiful world, or video, whatever it is you do.